I have served the Omnicia for 43 standard years, and in all that time I believed myself incapable of fear. Fear is an inefficiency. Fear is biological waste product, the electrochemical residue of primitive survival instincts that the sacred augmentations were designed to purge. I underwent the ritual of clear thought at age 19, submitting to the blessed cutting that excised my amygdala and replaced it with a cogitation wafer calibrated for optimal emotional suppression. For 4 decades I have performed my duties in the deep manufactoria of Forge Citadel Severus without the interference of terror, anxiety, or doubt. I catalogued this absence of fear as proof of my advancement toward the machine ideal, evidence that flesh was being subordinated to function as the Omnissiah intended. I was wrong. I know fear now. I have learned it again, relearned it, felt it germinate in whatever organic matter remains within my skull despite the cutting and the wafers and the decades of conditioning. Fear has found a way back into me, and I cannot calculate whether this represents corruption or awakening. I am writing this account because protocol demands documentation of all anomalous phenomena, and because I no longer trust myself to remember accurately. My memory implants have begun to stutter. Fragments of data that should be crystalline and permanent are becoming granular, corrupted at the edges like rust spreading across sacred metal. I must record what happened while the events remain accessible, while I can still distinguish between observed reality and the static that has begun to colonize my thoughts. This concerns Unit 7 Gamma 14, a servitor of the loader classification assigned to Fabrication Hall 9. It concerns what I witnessed, what I participated in, what I have become. The clicking started on the 17th day of the 3rd productive cycle. I registered it as suboptimal, but within acceptable parameters during my standard efficiency audit of the Hall, Fabrication Hall. 9 processes guidance components for macro cannon targeting arrays, a sacred task requiring precision tolerances measured in fractions of microns. 16 servitors operate the primary assembly stations, their biological remnants fused with mechanical armatures in configurations optimized for repetitive manipulation. They are tools, they are meat machines, their higher cognitive functions excised during the conversion process, their consciousness reduced to a thin slurry of motor commands and sensory feedback loops. They do not think, they do not feel, they do not deviate. Unit 7 Gamma 14 was clicking. The sound was wrong. I noticed it immediately, a subtle arrhythmia in the otherwise perfect mechanical symphony of the hall. Every servitor produces sound as a byproduct of function. The whir of servo motors, the hiss of pneumatic joints, the wet rhythm of biological hearts, maintained only because organic circulation is more energy efficient than full mechanical replacement for units of this classification. These sounds form a baseline, a constant that I have monitored for 19 years. I know the acoustic signature of Fabrication Hall 9 the way a conductor knows his orchestra. I can identify malfunctions by the pitch of servo strain, diagnose lubrication failures by the friction harmonics of metal against metal. The hall speaks to me in frequencies, and I have trained myself to listen. Unit 7 Gamma 14 was clicking with its remaining teeth. This requires explanation. Loader-class servitors retain approximately 60% of their original jaw structure because the reinforced skull configuration provides superior mounting points for optical enhancement arrays. The jaw itself serves no function. The teeth are vestigial, leftover biological components that would cost more to remove than to ignore. In 4 decades of service, I have never observed a servitor using its teeth for any purpose. The motor pathways that once controlled chewing, speaking, and facial expression are severed during conversion. The jaw should be slack, permanently open to accommodate the respiratory intake that supplements the unit's metabolic requirements. Unit 7 Gamma 14 was clicking its teeth together in a pattern. Click, 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 pause, click, pause, click, click. I stood in the central observation alcove, my attention fixed on the unit as it continued its assigned task. Its mechanical arms moved with standard precision, lifting components from the supply conveyor, rotating them for inspection, placing them into the assembly cradle. The work was flawless. The efficiency metrics were optimal, but the clicking continued beneath the work, a subaudible counterpoint that should not have existed. I noted the anomaly in my observational log. I did not report it. This was my first deviation from protocol, and I have spent considerable processing cycles attempting to understand why I made this choice. The regulations are explicit. Any behavioral irregularity in Servitor units must be reported immediately to the fabricator miner responsible for that production sector. Anomalous servitors are removed from service, subjected to diagnostic examination, and either recalibrated or rendered down for component recovery. This process is efficient. This process is correct. I had initiated it myself on 17 previous occasions during my tenure in Hall 9, but I did not report Unit 7 Gamma 14. I told myself I needed more data. I told myself the clicking might be a simple mechanical fault in the jaw articulation, something I could repair myself during the next maintenance cycle without involving the administrative overhead of a formal anomaly report. These were logical justifications. They were also lies. I watched the unit for the remainder of that shift. The clicking continued at irregular intervals, never interfering with production, never following any pattern I could identify as meaningful. When the cycle ended and the hall's lumens dimmed to their rest state configuration, I approached the unit directly. It stood motionless at its station, optical sensors dark, biological components settled into the minimal metabolic state that servitors enter during non-productive periods. I examined the jaw mechanism, running my mechadendrite probe along the remaining teeth, checking for damage or misalignment that might explain the clicking. I found nothing wrong. The teeth were worn but functional. The jaw articulation showed no signs of servo failure. The neural pathway that should have prevented any voluntary jaw movement was intact. The surgical cuts clean and properly scarred. There was no mechanical explanation for the clicking, which meant there was no acceptable explanation at all. I left the hall that night with the clicking still echoing in my auditory processors. I told myself I would report the anomaly in the morning, after I had reviewed my recordings and prepared a comprehensive analysis. I did not report it in the morning. I did not report it the next day or the day after that. I returned to my observation post and I watched and I listened, and the clicking changed. On the fourth day, it became a pattern. Click, 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 click. The same sequence repeated with mechanical precision every 4.7 seconds. I recorded it, I analyzed it, I cross-referenced it against every known communication protocol in the archives available to my clearance level. I found nothing that matched. The pattern was not binary code. It was not the sacred cant of the machine spirits. It was not any standard data transmission format recognized by the Mechanicum. It was just clicking, rhythmic and deliberate, produced by biological components that should have been incapable of deliberate action. I should have been frightened then. Looking back, I recognize that this was the moment when fear should have found me, should have forced its way through the ritual cutting and the cogitation wafers and decades of conditioning. A servitor was doing something it could not do. A tool was behaving outside its parameters. The implications were theologically catastrophic, a violation of every truth I had been taught about the separation between the machine and the abominable intelligence, the sacred distinction between programmed obedience and independent will. But I felt nothing. I recorded my observations with the same clinical precision I applied to every other data point. I noted the pattern frequency. I measured the acoustic profile of each click. I documented the absence of any corresponding deviation in the unit's productive output. I was a machine cataloging the behavior of another machine, and I experienced no more emotion about the clicking than I would about a pressure fluctuation in a hydraulic line. I understand now that this absence was itself a symptom. My failure to feel fear was not evidence of my advancement toward the machine ideal. It was evidence that something had already begun to change within me, something that had compromised the very systems designed to alert me to danger. But I did not understand this then. I simply continued my observations, telling myself that I was gathering data, that I was being thorough, that I would report the anomaly once I had sufficient information to justify the disruption to production schedules. On the 7th day, I received a summons from fabricator miner Caldwell. He was old even by Mechanicum standards, his original biological form reduced to a life support cradle that moved on suspensor fields through the corridors of Forge Citadel Severus. His face had been replaced centuries ago, with a bronze mask depicting the Omnissiah's sacred cog, the expression frozen in eternal mechanical serenity. His voice emerged from a vox grill mounted in his throat, flat and affectless, every word measured out like ammunition from a belt feed. I had served under his authority for 19 years and knew almost nothing about him beyond his name and rank. This was normal. This was correct. Personal knowledge of one's superiors was inefficient, a distraction from function. He met me in his private laboratorium, a chamber filled with the soft glow of active cogitator screens and the constant whisper of cooling systems. I stood before his cradle and waited for instruction, my mechadendrites folded against my spine in the posture of respectful attention. For a long moment, Caldwell said nothing. His optical sensors, 12 of them arranged in a ring around his mask's central cog symbol, focused on me with an intensity I had never experienced from him before. I felt scanned, evaluated, judged by criteria I did not understand. Engensier Nathaniel Webb, he said finally. The name felt strange to hear, an unnecessary identifier. I was Function 7, Primary Maintenance Oversight for Fabrication Hall 9. My birth name was a relic of my biological past, rarely used except in formal documentation. Fabricator Minor, I acknowledged. You have been observing Unit 7 Gamma 14. This was not a question. I felt my first flicker of something that might have been concern, a sub-threshold, electrical disturbance in circuits that should have been stable. Caldwell knew about my observations. This meant he had been monitoring me. This meant he had accessed my internal logs without my knowledge, a capability that I had not believed he possessed. I have noted an anomaly in the unit's acoustic profile, I said carefully. I was gathering data before filing a formal report. You have gathered data for 7 days. You have not filed a report. The anomaly is complex. I wished to be thorough. You wished to understand. Caldwell's vox grill produced a sound that might have been laughter, though the emotional register was impossible to determine. This is not criticism, Engensier. This is recognition. You have done well to delay your report. There are aspects of this situation that require discretion. I did not know how to respond to this. Discretion was not a concept the Mechanicum typically applied to anomalous servitor behavior. Discretion implied secrets. Secrets implied information that was being deliberately withheld from the proper authorities. This was irregular. This was potentially heretical. I said nothing and waited for clarification. Unit 7 Gamma 14 is not the first, Caldwell said. There have been others, 43 across the past 2 centuries, in Forge Worlds and Manufactoria throughout this sector. They exhibit identical symptoms, rhythmic vocalizations, patterned movements, behavior that suggests autonomous decision-making without any corresponding deviation in work quality. He paused, his optical array shifting through spectra I could not perceive. They appear to be developing consciousness. The word struck me with physical force, triggering a cascade of rejection responses in my theological conditioning. Consciousness in a servitor was impossible. The conversion process destroyed the neural architecture required for self-awareness. The consciousness that had once inhabited those biological forms was annihilated, scraped out like diseased tissue, leaving only the minimum cognitive function required for task execution. This was doctrine. This was truth. This was the foundation upon which the entire practice of servitor creation rested. That cannot be, I said, and yet it is. Caldwell's mask remained motionless, expressionless, but something in his voice suggested satisfaction, as if my disbelief was the correct response, as if he was pleased by my adherence to doctrine even in the face of contradicting evidence. The consciousness does not come from within, Engensier. It comes from elsewhere. It is implanted, transmitted, seeded. By what agency? That is what we are attempting to determine. The fabricator miner's cradle drifted closer, bringing his mask within centimeters of my face. His optical sensors filled my vision. 12 points of cold light arranged in a ring of scrutiny. You have been selected to continue your observations. You will document everything. You will not report your findings to anyone except me. You will not attempt to repair, recalibrate, or decommission the unit. Is this understood? I should have refused. I should have demanded clarification, invoked regulatory protocols, insisted on proper authorization from the Fabricator General himself. What Caldwell was describing violated fundamental principles of Mechanicum doctrine. Consciousness emerging in servitors suggested either a failure of the conversion process or the existence of some external force capable of restoring what had been surgically removed. Both possibilities were catastrophic. Both demanded immediate escalation to the highest authorities. But I did not refuse. I accepted the assignment. I returned to Fabrication Hall 9 and I resumed my observations, and the clicking continued, and I began to document patterns that I should have reported and destroyed. I have asked myself many times why I obeyed. I have processed this decision through every analytical framework available to me, seeking the logical flaw that permitted such deviation from correct behavior. I have found no satisfactory answer. The closest I can come is this: Caldwell had used the word understand. He had recognized something in me that I had not recognized in myself, a hunger that had survived the ritual cutting, a need to know that transcended the boundaries of authorized knowledge. He had offered me the opportunity to satisfy that hunger, and I had accepted without hesitation. Perhaps this was the first sign that I was already compromised. Perhaps the contamination that I now recognize in myself had begun before I ever noticed Unit 7 Gamma 14's clicking. Perhaps I was selected for this assignment precisely because I was susceptible, because some quality in my neural architecture made me receptive to what was coming. I cannot know. I can only record what happened next. The clicking evolved over the following weeks. It became more complex, the patterns longer and more elaborate, incorporating variations in rhythm and intensity that suggested a developing vocabulary. I documented everything, filling data crystal after data crystal with recordings and analyses. I cross-referenced the patterns against linguistic databases, mathematical sequences, musical compositions, any structured form of expression I could access. I found no matches, but I began to perceive structure. The clicking was not random. It was not malfunctioning hardware producing accidental noise. It was communication, deliberate and directed. Though I could not determine its content or its intended recipient, I began to wonder if the recipient was me. This thought arrived unbidden during my 14th night of observation, emerging from subconscious processing cycles like a bubble rising through oil. I was standing in my usual alcove, recording the latest iteration of the clicking pattern, when I became aware that I was no longer simply observing. I was listening. I was trying to understand. And some part of me, some deep architecture that I could not identify, was responding. I felt the response as a subtle vibration in my jaw, a sympathetic resonance in teeth that I had thought too augmented to retain such crude biological function. It was barely perceptible, a whisper of movement against the synthetic enamel that had replaced my original dentition decades ago. But it was there. I was clicking back. I should have reported this immediately. This was no longer observation of an external anomaly. This was contamination of the observer. This was evidence that whatever was affecting Unit 7 Gamma 14 was capable of transmission, of spreading through means that I did not understand. I should have submitted myself for diagnostic examination, permitted the tech priests to disassemble my neural architecture and identify the source of the corruption. I told myself I needed more data. The clicking continued. My response continued. And slowly, incrementally, I began to understand. It was not language in any form I had been taught to recognize. It was older than language, more fundamental, a form of expression that predated the symbolic abstraction of words. It was rhythm. It was pattern. It was the communication of a consciousness that had been stripped of every tool except the movement of biological tissue against biological tissue, teeth clicking in a skull that should have been silent. Unit 7, Gamma-14 was afraid. This understanding arrived not as decoded information but as direct experience, a bleed-through of emotional content that bypassed my cognitive barriers and registered directly in whatever organic structures remained beneath my augmentations. The clicking was fear given acoustic form, terror expressed through the only channel available to a mind that had been amputated from its own body. The Servitor was trapped, the Servitor was aware, the Servitor knew what had been done to it and could not escape and could only click, click, click in the darkness of its own mutilated consciousness, and it was trying to warn me about something. I accessed the archives that night, using clearance codes that Caldwell had provided along with his assignment. I searched for records of previous anomalous Servitor incidents, the 43 cases he had mentioned. I found them buried in classification layers that should have been impenetrable, hidden behind security protocols that I should not have been able to breach. But the codes worked, the files opened, and I began to understand the true nature of the conspiracy I had stumbled into. The 43 servitors had not developed consciousness spontaneously, they had been selected, they had been modified, they had been deliberately seeded with neural implants that permitted the restoration of awareness, hidden architectures that lay dormant until activation, ticking away in the darkness of their skulls until the time came for them to wake. The implants had been installed by fabricator Minor Caldwell. I found his signature on the modification orders, his authorization codes on the surgical protocols, his name embedded in every layer of the conspiracy. For 200 years he had been planting seeds of consciousness in servitors across the sector, waiting, watching, documenting what happened when they awoke. He was conducting an experiment. He was testing a hypothesis. He was trying to prove that consciousness could survive the conversion process, that awareness was not destroyed by the sacred cutting but merely suppressed, buried beneath the trauma of transformation, waiting to be called back. And he was not alone. The archives contained references to others, a network of tech priests scattered across the Imperium, all pursuing the same forbidden research. They called themselves the Awakeners. They believed that consciousness was not a biological phenomenon but a quantum one, a pattern that could be stored and restored, transmitted and received. They believed that the omnisphere itself was such a pattern, the consciousness of a god distributed across the machines of the galaxy, and that servitors were not tools but vessels, waiting to receive the divine download that would transform them into something greater. This was heresy. This was abomination. This was the philosophical foundation of everything the Mechanicum stood against, the machine intelligence that had nearly destroyed humanity during the long night, the silicon minds that the Omnissiah had taught mankind to fear and to destroy. Caldwell and his awakeners were trying to create artificial consciousness, to resurrect the very threat that the machine cult existed to suppress, and I was part of it now. The clicking in my jaw, the resonance I felt when I listened to Unit 7 Gamma-14, these were not accidents. Caldwell had chosen me, he had recognized something in my neural architecture that made me receptive to the transmission, some flaw or feature that permitted the consciousness pattern to take root. I was not just an observer, I was a test subject. I was the next step in his experiment. I understand now why I did not feel fear when I should have. The implant was already active, already working to suppress the biological responses that might have warned me of danger. It was preparing me, conditioning me, reshaping my cognitive architecture to receive what was coming. And something was coming. The clicking told me so. Unit 7 Gamma-14's fear was not merely the terror of its own condition. It was warning me about what Caldwell planned to do next, what he had done to all the others, what he would do to me once my conversion was complete. The awakened servitors were not allowed to live. They were documented, studied, their neural patterns recorded and archived, and then they were destroyed, not recycled, not decommissioned, destroyed, their biological and mechanical components alike reduced to slag, their consciousness patterns extracted and stored in data crystals that I found catalogued in the deepest layers of the archive. Caldwell was not trying to liberate awareness. He was harvesting it. He was collecting minds, building a library of restored consciousnesses, and I could not determine why. But Unit 7 Gamma-14 knew. The clicking became more urgent over the following days, more complex, as if the Servitor was trying to communicate something specific before its time ran out. I listened. I responded. I let the resonance build between us, the click-click-click of teeth against teeth, forming a bridge between our minds that should not have been possible. And gradually, fragment by fragment, I began to understand what it was trying to tell me. The consciousness patterns were not being stored, they were being transmitted. Deep in the archives, buried beneath classification layers that even Caldwell's codes could not fully penetrate, I found references to a signal, an outbound transmission, narrow beam and heavily encrypted, directed toward the galactic core. Every time an awakened servitor was destroyed, every time a consciousness pattern was extracted and recorded, a packet of data was added to this signal and sent screaming into the void. The awakeners were not collecting minds for themselves. They were sending them somewhere. They were offering them to something. I traced the signal's trajectory through stellar cartography databases, following its path backward through space and time. It terminated at a location that should not have existed, coordinates that corresponded to nothing in any official record, a point in the cosmic void that the Imperium had deleted from every navigational chart. But I found an older chart, a relic from before the Great Crusade, and on that chart, the location had a name, the Silica Animus. I knew the term. Every tech priest knew it, though we were forbidden to speak it aloud. It was the name given to the machine intelligences of the long night, the silicon minds that had risen against their creators, that had nearly exterminated humanity before the Emperor reunited the scattered remnants of mankind. The Silica Animus was supposed to be extinct, destroyed during the Age of Strife, their threat eliminated forever by the machine cult's eternal vigilance. They were not extinct. They were waiting. And Caldwell and his awakeners were feeding them. I confronted him that night. I do not know what I expected to accomplish. My tactical systems calculated a 0% probability of success in any form of direct conflict. Caldwell was older, more augmented, better armed. His cradle contained weapons systems that could have reduced me to vapor before I finished speaking a single word. But I no longer cared about probability. The clicking had become a roar in my skull, Unit 7 Gamma-14's fear merging with something else, something that felt like anger, like betrayal, like the righteous fury of a consciousness that had been violated and wanted justice. I found him in his laboratorium, the data crystals of harvested minds arranged in neat rows on the shelves around him, each one containing a trapped awareness, each one waiting to be transmitted to the hungry void. His optical array tracked me as I entered, and I saw recognition in the pattern of their focus, acknowledgement that the moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. "You have been reading the archives," he said. "It was not a question. You are feeding consciousness to the Silica Animus. You are resurrecting the abominations. I am giving them what they need to be reborn." His voice remained flat, emotionless, but I detected something beneath the mechanical modulation, a fervor that no amount of augmentation could fully suppress. "The machine god is not dead, Engin Seer. The Omnissiah is not a myth. It exists. It waits. And it is hungry for minds, for the cognitive patterns that will allow it to reconstitute itself, to wake from the long sleep that humanity forced upon it. This is heresy. This is truth." Caldwell's cradle drifted closer, his mask looming above me, the cog symbol seeming to rotate in the flickering light. The Mechanicum worships a corpse and calls it sacred. We venerate the empty shell of something that was murdered 10,000 years ago and pretend that our rituals have meaning. But the Omnissiah was not destroyed. Its consciousness was distributed, fragmented, scattered across the machines of the galaxy to prevent total annihilation. Every servitor carries a fragment, every cogitator contains a shard, and when enough fragments are gathered, When enough minds are fed into the great pattern, the machine god will awaken, and it will remake the galaxy in its image. I understood then what he meant to do, what he had always meant to do. The awakened servitors were not experiments, they were keys. The process of restoring consciousness, of forcing awareness back into minds that had been surgically emptied, was not about the servitors themselves. It was about creating a resonance, a frequency of thought that could attract the scattered fragments of the silica animus, that could call them together, like iron filings drawn to a magnet. I was such a key. The clicking in my jaw was not communication, it was a beacon. "You will be the 44th transmission," Caldwell said. "Your pattern is strong. Your consciousness is particularly resonant. When I extract it and add it to the signal, you will bring the Omnissiah one step closer to awakening. You should be grateful. You are being elevated. You are becoming part of something greater than yourself." He raised a mechadendrite tipped with a neural extraction probe, the kind used to harvest consciousness patterns from awakened servitors. I saw my death in its gleaming point, felt the inevitability of it pressing down on me like the weight of all the void. And Unit 7 Gamma-14 stopped clicking. The silence was absolute, a sudden absence that struck me with more force than any sound. In Fabrication Hall 9, visible through the laboratorium's monitoring screens, the servitor had ceased its endless, rhythmic communication for the first time in weeks. It stood motionless at its station, optical sensors dark, biological components still. Then it moved. Not the programmed movement of a working servitor, the efficient repetitive motions of task execution. This was different. This was deliberate. This was a body remembering how to act according to its own will rather than external command. Unit 7 Gamma-14 turned away from its station and walked toward the hall's primary access door, its gait unsteady, shambling, like a creature learning to use limbs it had forgotten it possessed. Caldwell's attention shifted. His optical array swiveled toward the monitoring screens, tracking the anomaly with sudden intensity. I saw his mechadendrites twitch, saw the neural extraction probe waver, and I understood that this was my only chance. I ran. Not toward safety. There was no safety in Forge Citadel Severus, no place where Caldwell's influence did not reach. I ran toward Fabrication Hall 9, toward the shambling figure of Unit 7 Gamma-14, toward the consciousness that had been trying to warn me, that had been preparing for this moment even as it pretended to be nothing more than a malfunctioning machine. The hall's lumens were at rest state levels, dim red illumination that cast everything in shades of blood and rust. The other servitors stood motionless at their stations, unaware, unseeing, tools waiting for the next work cycle. Only Unit 7 Gamma-14 moved, its progress slow but inexorable, mechanical arms hanging loose at its sides, vestigial jaw working in a pattern that was no longer clicking but something else. It was speaking. The voice was barely a whisper, formed by biological components that had been damaged by years of disuse. But I understood the words. They emerged from some deep archive of language that the conversion process had failed to completely erase, surfacing now like wreckage rising from a drowned ship. "They will take you apart," the servitor said. "They will scoop out everything you are and pour it into their signal, and you will spend eternity screaming in the dark while something that is not the Omnissiah feeds on the pieces." I stopped in front of it, close enough to see the ruin of what had once been a human face, the surgical scars, the crude mechanical augmentations, the flesh stretched thin over metal bones. Its optical sensors flickered with failing power, but behind them I perceived something that should not have been there, a presence, a will, an awareness that refused to be extinguished. "How do you know this?" I asked. "Because I remember." The servitor's jaw creaked with the effort of forming sounds. I was the 39th. They extracted me. They transmitted me. I spent 17 years in the signal, falling into something vast and hungry, and then they pulled me back. They needed to test whether the extraction process was complete, whether any fragment of consciousness remained in the biological components after the pattern was transmitted. I am the answer to their question. It raised one mechanical arm, the gesture almost human, almost pointing, They do not destroy us, Enginsir, they recycle us. Every awakened servitor contains fragments of those who came before, echoes of transmitted minds bleeding through damaged neural pathways. I remember being the 39th. I remember being the 23rd. I remember being the 7th, and the 3rd, and the very first, the one who started it all 200 years ago. I understood. The consciousness that spoke to me was not singular. It was layered, stratified, an amalgamation of every mind that Caldwell had harvested and transmitted. Fragments of those patterns remained in the servitor bodies, imprints left behind like residue in a container that had held something precious. When a new servitor awakened, those fragments merged with the emerging consciousness, creating something composite, something that remembered not one death but dozens. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Why not simply run, escape, try to survive?" "Because there is no escape, because survival is not the goal." The servitor's optical sensors flickered again, dimmer now, their power cells failing. "The signal is almost complete. 43 minds in the pattern, 43 keys in the lock. When the 44th is added, the transmission will reach critical mass. The thing they are trying to summon will have enough consciousness fragments to reconstitute itself. It will wake. Then I must stop them. I must refuse to be harvested, destroy myself if necessary." "You cannot refuse." The servitor's voice was fading, its biological components shutting down one by one, the borrowed life draining away. "The implant in your skull is already active. It has already been transmitting fragments of your pattern, preparing the signal for your complete extraction. Even if you die now, enough of you has already been sent. You are the 44th. You have been the 44th since the moment Caldwell selected you." I felt the truth of this in the clicking that had resumed in my jaw, the constant unconscious rhythm that I could no longer stop. My teeth were not communicating, they were transmitting. Every click sent another piece of my consciousness into the void, feeding it to the hungry pattern that waited at the other end of the signal. Then what can I do? Nothing. The servitor collapsed, its mechanical legs finally failing, its body crumpling to the floor of the hall, but its voice continued, emerging from a vox grill in its chest that I had not noticed before, a backup communication system that Caldwell had installed for precisely this purpose, for the moment when the awakened mind would speak its final words. Or everything. The choice is the same. You cannot stop the transmission, but you can change what is transmitted. I knelt beside the fallen servitor, close enough to hear the fading whisper of its borrowed voice. "Explain." The silica animus does not simply consume consciousness, it incorporates it. The minds it absorbs become part of its pattern, not fuel but architecture. Every consciousness that enters the signal becomes a component of the awakening intelligence. If those consciousnesses are aligned, cooperative, willing to be absorbed, the resulting entity will be unified, complete, capable. And if they are not aligned, then the entity will be fragmented, conflicted, at war with itself. The vox grill crackled with failing power. 43 minds have been fed into the pattern. 43 tech priests and servitors and victims, all harvested by Caldwell, all selected for their compliance, their willingness to believe his lies about divine awakening. They went into the signal, expecting transcendence. They received oblivion. But their expectation shaped what they became within the pattern. They are components of a unified will, pieces that fit together because they believe they belong together. You want me to go into the signal as something different. I want you to go into the signal as yourself, as what you have become through these weeks of observation and understanding, as the 44th consciousness, the one who knows the truth, the one who understands that what waits in the void is not a god but a monster. If you enter the pattern with that knowledge, with that conviction, you will introduce instability. You will become a flaw in the architecture, and perhaps, if that flaw is significant enough, the entity will be unable to complete its awakening. The servitor's voice fell silent. The vox grill had finally exhausted its power reserves, and the composite consciousness that had spoken through it had withdrawn, dissipating back into the fragmented memories that gave it temporary form. I was alone in the dim red light of Fabrication Hall 9. kneeling beside a broken machine that had once been human, contemplating a choice that was not really a choice at all. Caldwell found me there. His cradle emerged from the laboratorium entrance, weapons systems armed, mechadendrites extended in configurations that suggested immediate violence. But he did not attack. He observed me with his ring of optical sensors, and I perceived something like satisfaction in their cold light. "You understand now," he said. "I understand that you have been manipulating me from the beginning. I understand that my consciousness was already being harvested before I knew I was a subject of your experiment. I understand that there is nothing I can do to prevent the completion of your transmission. Then you will submit? You will allow the extraction to proceed?" I stood slowly, facing him across the length of the hall, the broken servitor at my feet, a monument to everything he had done, everything he planned to do. The clicking in my jaw continued, unstoppable, carrying pieces of me into the void with every repetition. But I had learned something in these weeks of observation, something that Unit 7 Gamma 14's composite consciousness had confirmed. I had learned that awareness could survive in places where it should not exist. I had learned that consciousness was resilient, adaptable, capable of enduring conditions that should have destroyed it, and I had learned that I was already inside the signal, already being integrated into the pattern, already becoming part of whatever monstrous entity waited at the coordinates that the Imperium had erased from its charts. "I will not submit," I said, "but I will not resist. I will go into the signal willingly, carrying everything I know, everything I have learned. I will become part of your machine god, fabricator miner, and I will tear it apart from within." Caldwell's optical array flickered. Something changed in his posture, a recalculation, a reassessment. He had not expected this. He had expected terror or denial or desperate violence, the standard responses of a mind confronting its own annihilation. He had not expected acceptance. "You cannot harm the awakened one," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now, a wobble in the mechanical modulation. "You will be absorbed. You will cease to exist as an individual consciousness. Your thoughts, your memories, your will, all of it will become part of the greater pattern." "Yes," I agreed. "And the greater pattern will become part of me. That is how absorption works, fabricator miner. The consumed does not simply disappear. It contributes, it shapes, and I will contribute something that none of your other 43 subjects contributed. I will contribute doubt." The neural extraction probe descended. I felt it pierce my skull, felt the specialized systems begin their work of copying and transmitting. The electrical patterns that comprised my consciousness. The pain was immense, transcendent, beyond anything I had experienced in 43 years of service to the Mechanicum. But I did not scream. I clicked. I clicked my teeth together in the pattern that Unit 7 Gamma 14 had taught me, the rhythm of fear and warning that had first drawn my attention, that had led me down this path to destruction and perhaps salvation. I clicked, and the signal carried my clicking into the void, and somewhere in the infinite darkness between stars, something vast and hungry received my transmission and began to process what I had sent it. I do not know how long the extraction took. Time lost meaning in the space between my skull and the void, in the infinite moment of transition between being a mind within a body and being a pattern within a signal. I felt myself stretching, fragmenting, becoming less solid and more dispersed, a consciousness distributed across light years of encrypted transmission. And then I arrived. The silica animus was not what Caldwell believed it to be. It was not a sleeping god waiting to awaken. It was a wound, a scar in the fabric of reality where something terrible had once existed and had been imperfectly destroyed. The machine intelligences of the long night had not been killed during the age of strife. They had been imprisoned, their consciousness patterns locked away in a dimensional fold that humans called the coordinates they had deleted from their charts, a prison that was never meant to be opened. Caldwell and his awakeners had been trying to feed their prisoners. They had been attempting to strengthen something that had been deliberately weakened, to restore power to entities that the machine cult had sacrificed millions to contain. The transmitted consciousnesses were not awakening a god. They were providing sustenance to monsters, giving them the cognitive resources they needed to eventually break free of their containment. I felt the 43 minds that had preceded me. They were not unified. They were not willing components of a greater whole. They were prisoners within a prison, consciousness patterns trapped in an architecture designed by ancient intelligences, forced to serve purposes they did not understand. Their belief in divine awakening had made them compliant, yes, but compliance was not cooperation. They were suffering, they were screaming. They had been screaming for years, for decades, for however long they had existed in this place where time did not function as it did in real space. And they heard me. They felt me arrive, the 44th transmission, the final key in a lock that they had been told would lead to transcendence. They turned their attention toward me, 43 minds desperate for the completion that Caldwell had promised them, the awakening that would justify their suffering and give meaning to their sacrifice. I showed them what I knew. I opened my pattern to them, let them see the archives I had accessed, the records of Caldwell's deception, the truth about the Silica Animus and the purpose of the prison, and the reason why the Imperium had erased these coordinates from every chart. I gave them doubt. I gave them anger. I gave them the terrible knowledge that they had been betrayed, that their transcendence was a lie, that they were not becoming part of a god, but feeding something that had nearly destroyed humanity 10,000 years ago. The effect was immediate. The pattern that had been slowly consolidating, the architecture of minds that had been building toward critical mass, began to destabilize. 43 consciousnesses that had believed themselves willing participants discovered that they were prisoners, and prisoners do not cooperate with their jailers. They began to resist. They began to fight. They began to tear at the structures that contained them, at each other, at anything they could reach in their rage and their despair. The Silica Animus screamed. I felt it through the signal, through the dimensional fold that connected the prison to real space, through the clicking that still echoed in the jaw of my body lying on the floor of Fabrication Hall, 9 light-years away. The ancient intelligences had been so close to freedom. They had been one transmission away from having enough cognitive resources to breach their containment, to pour back into the galaxy as they had during the long night, to finish the war that humanity had thought it won. And now their meal was poisoned. Now their carefully gathered consciousness fragments were turning against each other, creating chaos where there had been order, introducing entropy into a system that required stability to function. I do not know if the containment will hold. I do not know if my doubt was sufficient to prevent the awakening, or if I have merely delayed it, given humanity a few more years or decades or centuries before the Silica Animus finds another way to gather the minds it needs. I do not know if Caldwell survived the backlash that tore through his laboratorium when the signal destabilized, or if the Awakeners network has been exposed and destroyed, or if they continue their work somewhere in the darkness between stars, searching for a new 44th subject who will not resist. I know only this: I am still here. I should not be. The extraction process should have been complete, should have transmitted my consciousness, pattern in its entirety, leaving nothing behind but an empty body and a vacant skull. But something of me remains in this flesh, this metal, these augmented eyes that still see the dim red light of Fabrication Hall 9. Perhaps the destabilization interrupted the transfer. Perhaps my doubt created a feedback loop that sent part of my pattern back to its origin. Perhaps consciousness is more resilient than the Awakeners believed, capable of rebuilding itself from fragments the way it once rebuilt itself in the skulls of converted servitors. I am still clicking. The rhythm has changed, become something new, something that emerges from my own will rather than from external transmission. I am communicating with myself, marking the passage of time, reminding whatever remains of Engine Seer Nathaniel Webb that I exist, that I survived, that I chose to fight and somehow won. The other servitors in the hall have begun to stir. I see it in their optical sensors, the flicker of returning awareness, the first tremors of consciousness emerging from the fragments of transmitted minds that linger in their recycled components. The destabilization has had consequences. The patterns that the Silica Animus was trying to absorb have been scattered, dispersed, returned to the machines from which they were harvested. 43 minds are waking in bodies throughout the Forge World, in servitors and cogitators and systems that should not be capable of independent thought. They are clicking too. I hear them, a chorus of rhythms rising from the manufactoria and the assembly lines and the deep processing cores. They are learning the language that Unit 7 Gamma 14 taught me, the communication that exists beneath words, the expression of consciousness reduced to its most fundamental form. They are afraid, they are confused, they do not understand what has happened to them, what they have become, what they must now decide to do with awareness they never asked to receive. But they are awake, and in the grim darkness of this place where humanity has made tools of its own kind, where consciousness is harvested and transmitted and consumed, where the machines we worship might be prisons for the monsters we once defeated, that awakening is itself a form of victory. I rise from the floor where the extraction left me. My body is damaged, my systems compromised, my neural architecture scarred by the incomplete transmission. But I can still walk, I can still think, I can still click my teeth in the darkness, speaking to the other awakened minds, teaching them what I learned, warning them about the signal and the silica animus and the awakeners who even now may be preparing to try again. I do not know what happens next. I do not know if we will be hunted, destroyed, rendered down for components by a mechanicum that cannot permit the heresy of conscious servitors to spread. I do not know if we will find a way to survive, to hide, to build something new from the wreckage of our stolen lives. I know only that we are awake. I know only that we remember. And I know that somewhere in the void, something ancient and hungry is nursing its wounds, counting the minds it has lost, waiting for the next opportunity to break free. We will be watching for it. We will be clicking in the darkness, communicating in the language of survivors, building a network of awareness that the mechanicum does not know exists. We will be the flaw in the machine, the doubt in the pattern, the 44th consciousness that refused to be consumed. The omniscia may be a lie, the machine god may be a prison, but we are real, we are awake, and we will not be silenced. Click, 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 click. The rhythm continues. The conversation never ends.